Rag Bairagi. Sa re ga ma sa la la la.
I don't like this sort of cliche that Indians simply aren't private, that as a nation we're not private or as a culture we're not private, but I can see that maybe the things that we consider private and public are different. Maybe the line between the private sphere and the public sphere might fall somewhere different from where it does in the West, but I don't believe that we're not private.
Privacy exists in different forms, and at different levels of abstraction. If you look at the Indian situation today, offline, there is no privacy. You could have a credit card verification guy who comes to your house and asks for a whole lot of information, writes it down on a book, and you don't know what happens to that book or to that guy who came to verify your credit card information. So, to a large extent, privacy, generally speaking, in India just doesn't exist.
And I think that kind of gets to what might be different about India. Maybe the things that we consider private, we may not consider financial information private, we may not consider passwords or ATM pins private. We share them in a collectivist kind of way, the way we share a lot of things within families. But I think there are certain things that we would consider very private and that the invasions of which we would consider transgressions.
Privacy is not so much dead as much as it is accessible by a certain group of people more easily than by others. So the more privileged you are, the richer you are, the whiter you are, well, the more male you are, etc. It's easier to have a certain access to privacy and related rights than others. So it's a paradox because it's possibly needed most by people who are not able to access it.
So I think even when you look at the case law in India, it very much develops from this notion of bodily privacy, which derives from the right to life, a right to live with dignity. When people are incarcerated, do they lose certain rights? How are they to be treated in prisons? And most of our privacy jurisprudence starts from that point of view of the body as a private space. And the notion of information or data as being private is something that's only slowly being taken seriously. It's a slow sort of transition towards that. So I think the notion of what is private and what might not be private is still in flux and is developing. And I think with the kind of regimes where that the state is implementing, where people are being documented, where biometrics are being taken, where all kinds of big data projects are being rolled out, I actually think the notion of privacy is going to get even more finely grained than it used to be.
The way a lot of us live our lives is to somehow divide it into different spheres, and these spheres may overlap, like my personal life might overlap to some extent with my family life, which might overlap with my work life. But there's a lot of information that is only relevant and only in those parts. And I think a surveillance mechanism or something like even the Unique Identity Project or any kind of nation-based either surveillance project or databasing project disturbs that way in which we live our lives and disturbs that precarious control that we have over the kind of information that we want to share and where we want to share.
I think it's assumed some other form, and I think it's actually more important than it ever was. I think privacy in some ways might be dead, but I think the value of privacy might have changed.
I don't think privacy is dead, and if you are living in a democracy, then privacy is very, very essential to maintain the health of the democracy.
People already think that, yes, on paper we're a democracy, but are we really, when votes can be bought, when your rights are transgressed in every way, where the rule of law or the lawlessness of things make it so difficult for you to protest anything, where that sort of kills any desire to protest, where people subvert everything, your democracy is pretty flawed to start with.
This is a very complex issue, but at the end of the day, what is the state? The state is meant to protect the citizen. Now, if the citizen's rights are going to be violated by the state in the name of, say, combating terrorism, then I think that is a failure of the state. Ideally, if you are looking at security for the citizens, then you have to develop processes which are competent enough to protect the citizen without violating the rights of the citizen. And this has been well debated over decades, and most progressive democratic societies have now more or less agreed and codified the fact that privacy is as important an element of the security of the state and the citizen as much as, say, combating terrorism.
There is always a tension between the public interest and the individual's interest. So I don't think this inherent tension would be any different when it comes to the cyberspace. An individual will have to trade off a part of his privacy and his freedoms, online freedoms, in order to have online security and offline security as well. So what I think is more important is how that tension, or how that dichotomy between security and privacy is negotiated in a democratic republic. Is that balance handed down by tradition? Is it handed down by fiat? It is handed down by an opaque group of people who make the law and say this is the balance between security and privacy? Or is it negotiated as part of a wider public discourse, and democracy as a whole provides an answer to that, where that balance should lie?
I think a lot of policymakers in India don't seem to buy into. They seem to think that the technology allows us to constantly monitor, they allow us to constantly surveil, and as storage becomes cheaper and cheaper, let's just collect everything and worry about it later. It may be relevant.
An aspect of cybersecurity is to protect privacy. For example, if somebody were to hack into your personal data or even your official data, isn't that supposed to be an issue of cyber security? And if that is the case, then how can you dissociate both of them?
The Indian government doesn't encrypt its own data, and we're often seeing documents leaked by the Indian government. So I'm not sure they're in the best position to advise other people on how to use technology, but if they want that to be real and have some teeth, they need to change the laws around encryption strengths. We have the weakest encryption strength that's allowed, so so pretty much people turn everything off.
Well, Indian government takes it as a right to intrude into citizens' lives and does not offer any counter protection. And as far as judicial oversight is concerned, it has not even thought of. See, initially, most issues of legal phone tapping and interception, wiretapping, and most issues of cyber interception are in many ways mandated by a 1996 Supreme Court judgment, which mandated that if you are going to conduct wiretaps, then there has to be a certain process in place. So having done that, the current situation was that, for example, the ISPs, that is the internet service providers and the telecom service providers, they were mandated to set up centers in their facilities where everything, whenever a legal requirement would come, they would at the switch give you this kind of data based, provided that it has been duly authorized and so on and so forth. But recently they have found cases and instances where there has been leakages from these kind of facilities. So the government of India therefore decided that we need to centralize everything and ensure that these kind of leakages don't take place. So they created what is called the Central Monitoring System. It's a huge multi-million-dollar project where everything will now come to one single source, and one single depository of this information will be created, and an audit trail will be created through digital means, where whoever requests, first it will be validated whether it is a valid request and all the processes are fallen through, and if they have taken place, then that particular data will be shared.
The government of India and its agencies have not shown any great amount of competence in the kind of surveillance they carry out, in the kind of techniques they use to maintain internal security, or indeed to form the kind of laws necessary which would balance privacy and national security. So the first question we ought to ask as citizens is the government competent enough to carry out its responsibilities in an information age?
There was this really terrifying spreadsheet where it was a list of about 161 people who had been threatened, abused, physically harmed, and actually died. So it was this whole gradation of actual physical harm, where in the process of seeking transparency from their government and accountability, their own privacy was compromised and sacrificed, and their being visible in the context of making these claims and of asking these questions, which they're perfectly entitled to do in a democracy and under a statute that allows them to do this, they were physically at risk.
The danger with such a system here is that this works in a system where we have complete faith that the government will not misuse this data. You have prevented private players from misusing the data, but now what safeguards do you have of the government, that because everything is being done in an opaque manner? For example, even questions under the Right to Information Act about what the architecture is, answers are being denied on that on the grounds that this will threaten national security. I fail to understand how national security is compromised if a system which will facilitate lawful interception is discussed openly, and it should. So since this is a completely opaque system, A, we don't know what the safeguards are, and B, since we don't know what the safeguards are, we have no idea whether this is being misused at all in the first place.
Unlike a lot of other countries where threats are external, I actually feel a lot of threats are internal. You know, we as citizens are exposed to far greater threats from our own government snooping on us than anybody else trying to hack into Indian systems. So I actually think the framework of law plays a very important role in either enabling surveillance or enabling security to be handled in a certain way. And I think the law can be a block, or it can actually free up space. And I don't see how you can divorce technology from the legal and social and political environment in which it functions.
Usually my experience and history tells us that once a power is available to an entity, whether it is the government or a private body, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So when you are giving this kind of a power minus safeguards or questionable safeguards, there is tremendous potential for misuse.
Yeah, I think as with a lot of things, where you're sitting has a lot to do with your view of the world. And I think if you are sitting in a government seat, your view of cybersecurity is probably everything is a threat, whether it's external, internal, domestic, international. There is a sort of paranoid view of what cybersecurity is intended to tackle. But I think as an ordinary citizen or a layperson, you may not distinguish between an external threat or, a government attempt to hack into military databases or, to get government intelligence. I think that you may often feel that your security is compromised by a legal regime or by certain statutes that allow a certain kind of surveillance or censorship, or that, say for example, if you have very low encryption strengths that are legally permitted in India, that impacts what you as a citizen can do to secure your communications. So I think it has a lot to do with your definition of cybersecurity and what it's meant to tackle and what your threat model is.
The disturbing part about surveillance and databasing, or broadly perhaps technology more working towards the interests of the state rather than my pleasures and my projects or my interests, is precisely that I lose that precarious control over how I share my information, how I lead my life, what is available, what is known about it.
I think there are different notions of surveillance. You have this whole, you have the whole Big Brother analogy and the whole panopticon, and when everybody is watched, do they behave differently? When you know that the jailer has complete visibility of everything that you do, the Foucault notion of it, and the Bentham notion of this panopticon, where everything you do is visible, and therefore you think before you act, you think before you speak. That's a very powerful metaphor in the surveillance sphere, but I think that's often quite a misleading metaphor, because it implies that you're being watched. Whereas a lot of the surveillance that takes place nowadays is invisible. You don't know that you're being surveilled. And if you don't know that you're being surveilled, are you really modifying your behavior because of it? If you don't know that it exists, is it really impacting you? Is it really creating a chilling effect? Yet it is happening, and there's all this data being collected about you, and decisions are being made that you're not aware of. And is that actually scarier?
Actually, to be very honest, Indians are quite clueless about how much personal data is being collected and in how many forms, because many of these forms are now being done in a manner which seems very innocuous, but all the data in the end is ending up with one single repository, which is the government. So therefore there are huge issues here which Indians are mostly unaware of.
People ignore privacy policies, people click through terms and conditions, and therefore websites are designed to get you to disclose more and more things. And I think that's something we're not really aware of in India, where the surveillance takes place.
More and more Indians start using the net for the first time. They are not quite sure of the etiquettes of online behavior. We used to call it netiquette in the good old days. So if you see a lot of new users behaving in ways which we find strange, it's because they've not been sensitized to online etiquette, online patterns of use. How do you work with others online, how do you treat others online, how do you deal with strangers, and a subset of that is how do you protect yourself and not harm others online as well. So a large part of this is to do with civic education, online civic education, and of which cyber security, privacy education would be a significant part. But I think we should look at it more of a way to sensitize the online Indian or the online public onto the norms of behavior online, and then the rest will follow.
If you just abdicate responsibility for your privacy and your free speech to some amorphous, altruistic notion of what governments and corporations should do, you shouldn't then be surprised if they don't take those things seriously. And I think users should be doing a lot more to protect how they interface with technology.
A magnificent strike into the crowd. India lift the World Cup.
Firefox, Opera, Facebook या Chrome.
With the row over snooping allegations, the father of the woman who was allegedly spied upon by Gujarat police.
My first recollection of using a computer, I think I was 12 and in primary school, and we used to have these option between, you could either choose lessons in typing, because typing was a skill which was being taught in schools once upon a time, or you could opt out and take computing. I'm kind of often very confused with what it means to be anonymous, right? Because anonymity, for example, presumes that there is an identity which first needs to be secure and preserved, and then you need to perform something else which does not betray your original identity. And in that way, it's not just about the value of anonymity online, but the value of anonymity as a social currency. What does it help you perform might be a more interesting question to ask, for instance, right?
On the one hand, it's not that your being online and your presence in a way in a virtual realm dematerializes you from all of your identity traps, including that of gender. But at the same time, I think, and this is where one has to look at the early histories of the internet. So in the multi-user dungeons in the early days of the internet, one of the greatest kind of games that was played was gender guessing.
So for example, I remember being on Lambda Mu in '99, and at that point the surprise that somebody had when they finally figured out after 6 months of talking that I don't live in the US, that I don't go to an American university, that I live actually in India, and encountering those first neo-colonial questions of, are you in India really? How do you speak English? And my general response used to be through my mouth, how do you speak English? It was kind of nice to have this almost real-time looking interaction that was possible, and that for the longest time you weren't even sure if the person you are interacting with, what geography they are from and so on, because they were not polite questions to ask.
This is Doordarshan News. Good evening and welcome. In the headlines, Finance Minister says austerity package will not go against the interests of the working class. Centre convenes conference of chief ministers to discuss issues relating to basic minimum services. Awami League leader Sheikh Hasina invited to form next government in Bangladesh. China not to sign comprehensive test ban treaty. And in cricket,
I think security is a very fundamental value or state of being for human beings. If you think of what are the most disempowering states in your life, it's the states where you are most insecure. You need to have a certain sense of security to be able to use the internet, to be able to be fearless in what you do on the internet.
Normally, laws are made after the effect, so to speak, after the crime is committed, after mistakes are made. That's how law originates. So the cyber world being new. Now, who should be the best person or has the best judgment to make laws, implement laws, and follow laws? Is it the ministers? Is it the judiciary? Or is it the cyber experts? So I think one need to have discourse and then formulate a mechanism through which you can make laws.
Not while the minister is replying. Why is this? Tiwari ji, please, Ravi Shankar Prasad ji, you know the rules. But minister is not yielding. Minister is not yielding, and you are simply saying, no, please. If you want, I will allow you time later if you want, please.
A lot of the bureaucrats, especially people who deal with cybersecurity, come from a very statist perspective, where the safety and security of the state is the first thing you think of, and they see that as their job. So that's not my job. My job is to first of all think about user perspective of what the stake of people is in these debates. Different groups just come at it from a very different perspective. I think what's really important now, though, is to ensure that a conversation can happen amongst these. And what I think is a pity is that we don't always see the willingness to actually engage in that conversation yet.
Government is justified by saying to prevent terrorist act, one has to be ahead of terrorists, because terrorists can take 99 chances, but the law or the law enforcer has to be 100% on top of things to make sure that even the terrorists 99% they fail, one time they succeed, it causes major damage to the country.
Because cybersecurity is mostly conceptualized like that. It looks as if security online and privacy are opposite to each other. But actually, to be really secure, individuals should have the tools to make those decisions again themselves. And if they have the tools to make those decisions themselves, that means they can also decide how much they want to guard their privacy. So there seems to be a contradiction between the two. It's only because there is a faulty understanding of what cybersecurity means, at least if you approach it from a human rights perspective.
People ought to know what are the laws and regulations. At the same time, people also should be cognizant of the fact that whatever they're doing when they enter the cyber world, there's not just entering the country that you are resident of, but rather you are part of the whole world.
Given the political nature of social life in India, right? So I always grew up thinking that I could speak my mind about anything to anybody unless they can hit me, more or less, and sometimes also to people who can hit me. So there has always been a very vibrant atmosphere, at least of expression, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not only a good thing because it allows for, I don't know, the first thing that comes to mind is the hate speeches during the 1992 communal violences in Bombay. But it also allows for people to sit on a park bench in a garden at 4 o'clock in an afternoon and have a very strong critical reaction to whatever is happening around them. And sometimes it can be around celebrities, political figures, India's foreign policy, and so on and so forth.
So the way I would characterize this is that if you were to look at the relationship between Hindus and Muslims, or between religious communities in India, there is one way in which one can see it as a horizontal relationship, which are marked by conflict. You may have occasional violence, but there are various ways in which the communities have also learned to deal with each other, various forms, as it were, of speech that have kind of regulated the relationship between communities. Because now you have created a juridical category on the basis of which I can claim a certain kind of an affective hurt, but it also becomes one that is memorialized. It enters the archive of the state and enters the archive of relationship between communities. So for me, the idea of the cultural exception to be made for Indians in relation to speech regulation is a very dangerous path to go down in, because there is a classist assumption that censorship should operate only for an other, the other being the uneducated, illiterate, poor, woman, child, insane, etc. So when we conducted a workshop for the Film Censor Board, the chairperson of the board at that point in time, a well-known actress, told us that while I am all for free speech, I cannot allow it because India is a very poor, illiterate country.
If you look at the Indian Penal Code of 1860, there are several provisions which govern hate speech. First is sections 153A and B, which say that you cannot, which govern statements made which will incite religious or racial hatred or national origin or caste or creed or any of these, that statements made under this can be punished. There's also section 293 and 293B which say that statements made with the intention of hurting the religious feelings of anyone can also be are an offense.
Lala Rajpat Rai, when asked whether Indians had to be treated differently in terms of censorship, emphatically said no. He said he wanted the future citizens of a free India to grow up in an atmosphere in which they were exposed to all kinds of influences, good and bad, and for them to make up their minds. And that was the only assurance of a political kind of maturity that would emerge. It's sad, but 100 years later, we're still recycling the colonial myths about, the native kind of audience, or about native stupidity or native excitability. And a lot of that kind of, for me, actually underruns some of the contemporary debates about censorship in India as well. I think it's next to impossible to talk about cybersecurity anywhere in the world without referencing the law. And India, it's particularly impossible given a certain kind of a historical, trajectory that censorship or speech regulatory laws have had with the larger question of security of the state. And I think this is important to kind of historicize, because much of what we inherit in terms of cybersecurity issues in their kind of conflict with freedom of speech and expression have a much longer history. If you look at the web of laws that exists that can be used in a way to kind of curb various aspects of freedom online, you're really talking about a really intricate network. The visible ones of these are things like the Information and Technology Act, etc. But you also have a wide range of laws whose kind of application cannot even be anticipated.
See, I think there's Section 66A is also very clumsily worded because there was a legislative intent behind Section 66A, but the way it's been worded, it is so broad that almost any speech can come under one of the provisions of 66A. For instance, you look at Section 66A, the first clause, Clause A, which says, any person who sends by means of a computer resource or a communication device any information which is grossly offensive or has menacing character. The second one is 66AB, which says any information which he knows to be false, but for the purpose of causing intimidation, enmity, hatred, or ill will, persistently by making use of such computer resource or communication device.
The report on the arrest over a Facebook post is finally out. The IG's report says the arrests of the two girls could have been avoided. The report also says that charges against the two girls should be dropped at the earliest. In their defense, the involved cops say that the girls were arrested for their own protection. Now the report also recommends action be taken against the errant cops.
One of the big problems with Section 66A of the IT Act is that it introduces a set of terms which are very ambiguous because there is no precedent for them. So for example, like grossly offensive. Now, there is of course a public interest litigation at the moment that's pending that challenges the validity of 66A. But 66A has really kind of emerged as the spectre that haunts communication online in India. And the reason for that is very clearly, it's blatant abuse in highly publicized cases. Now, on the one hand, these cases have kind of raised, in a sense, a certain kind of a consciousness and a kind of indignation around the misuse of the law. But at the same time, it renders a large number of people extremely vulnerable. The problem is that the procedure is often the punishment in India. Now, we've seen in our own experience as lawyers, where when people write to us or seek our opinion on whether a certain kind of article that they're planning to write or a post that they want to make, etc., will pass the test of law, earlier we were very confident in giving them advice saying that you're absolutely protected in terms of 19(1)(a). But till such time that 66A is on the law books, I would be hesitant to give someone an absolute clean chit, given the ease with which this can happen.
It's way too vaguely framed, and because there have been a whole range of instances in which it was used in a way that clearly was illegitimate. I think a lot of people have gotten the message that if there is a need, it can and will be used against you. And whether or not people admit that, it will make you think twice about whether or not you will write what you think freely.
The second problem with 66A conceptually is the fact that you have a scenario increasingly where there is no distinction between the kind of speaking subject. There is an assumption of a certain flatness of all speaking subjects. So whether you're a, kind of a media house, or you're a politician, or you're an individual blogger, you're being treated on the same plane, and that's unacceptable. What 79 does is basically, it's the safe harbor provision that protects intermediaries from certain kinds of action, but is undone in a way by the IT rules that followed Section 79. And here, if you recognize that intermediaries are one of the key players in the environment and in the ecology of speech, then the kind of safeguard that's provided to an intermediary in a way is almost directly linked to the safeguards provided to an individual speaker.
So I think the struggle now, or the challenge, is going to be not about letting people know what anonymous speech is about or what conditions are needed for it, but in fact trying to understand now how do we perform new kinds of anonymities when we are online.
Google receives requests from the government to share information about its users. Now, here you have a situation where, as an intermediary, even if it does not want to, and if it is subject to legal compliance of this form, Google's actions have a direct impact on the individual. Now, till now, this issue has been seen primarily as one of regulation between the state and the intermediary, or between Google and the government of India. Now, what we really need to do is creatively think of ways in which individuals begin to assert this as a much larger kind of a structural question of speech, in which companies and governments may sometimes conflict, but very often collude, risking the rights of the individuals.
I think what we will now need is to realize that this is happening, that the act of witnessing, the act of documentation is no longer human to human, that there are a range of other kinds of collectives, artificial intelligences, databases and so on, which are doing that particular act. And now you need to safeguard against those kinds of witnessing.
If you believe that we need to have a right to privacy, and I define privacy as being able to make a decision yourself on how much you want to reveal, then obviously you need to have a right to anonymity. Because without the right to anonymity, you cannot really have the right to privacy. Because as part of the right to privacy, you have to be able to decide that you do not want to reveal anything at all. So if you would say that we can't have anonymity because it's bad for free speech, if that's a line you would take, then I think you're fundamentally undermining another right, and that can't work.
If there's already freedom of speech in a democratic country, then the anonymous commentary could be misplaced in many instances. Because the country is democratic, it does have freedom of speech. Hence, the laws protect you from speaking out. Then I think the citizens also have responsibilities, not just that democracy does not necessarily mean only freedom, but it also has duties. That you have a duty to say who you are and criticize the government or the employee or the policy, whatever, in your name. Having said that, if that particular country or the government does not allow or restrict freedom of speech, then in that sense, you have no option but to be anonymous. For example, in Tibet, even if you paste a poster on a wall saying just two words, human rights, you will be arrested, you go behind bars. If you just shout a slogan, you will be arrested, you will be imprisoned.
Anonymous speech will always enhance freedom of speech and expression, because by definition, someone who's truly engaged as a speaking subject and speaking the truth to power renders themselves vulnerable. And this vulnerability can in a way be offset by anonymity.
Greetings, Indians. We are anonymous. Currently it has been seen that the governments from various states and the center are in a spree to censor not only the internet but also the right to free speech and expression as declared in the Constitution of India.
The fact that there is something called anonymous has always been kind of in a way testimony to the idea that forms or certain forms of speech or speech acts are only possible with the veil of invisibility. Now there could be a number of reasons for this. On the one hand, it's just about a certain kind of a political courage where the risks are far too great. In fact, my contention would be that if there were much greater spaces of anonymity, you would actually have a lot more by way of revelations. The right to privacy and the right to free speech have often been understood as kind of distinct rights. But I think in the kind of ecology of online communication, it becomes crucial for us to look at the two as being inseparable. What we need now is a coming together of the two. Where if, for example, you're saying that certain forms of speech are only available and exercisable by you under conditions of relative privacy, then the question of speech cannot be distinguished from the question of privacy.
Yeah, okay. That's it, clap.
Thank you.